To infiltrate the highest circles of Gilded Age society, you needed three things: a title, a fortune, and flawless manners. But in the 1890s, a handful of women proved you could fake all three. They arrived in New York with nothing but audacity, claiming to be Russian countesses, lost Vanderbilt heirs, or illegitimate daughters of railroad kings. Within months, they were stealing diamonds from Fifth Avenue mansions and securing loans worth hundreds of thousands from the very aristocrats who prided themselves on detecting imposters. And yet, the most shocking truth was not how easily they deceived the upper class. It was how desperately the upper class wanted to be deceived. Chapter 1: The Anatomy of American Hunger. In 1893, New York's 400 wealthiest families controlled more money than the bottom 12 million Americans combined, and they were terrified it showed. The problem with new money is that it smells new. It carries the factory smoke, the railroad grease, the speculative fever of stock certificates signed in back rooms, and no amount of marble could cover that scent. The men who built America's industrial fortunes knew how to extract ore from mountains and profit from grain futures, but they did not know which fork to use at a 12-course dinner. Their wives could afford any gown in Paris, but could not decode the silent language of calling cards and social cuts that determined who mattered in Manhattan ballrooms. This was the paradox that defined Gilded Age America: unprecedented wealth generated in a single generation, coupled with suffocating insecurity about whether that wealth meant anything at all. John Jacob Astor's descendants lived in mansions that rivaled European palaces, but they knew their family fortune began with fur trading. Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandchildren threw parties costing $200,000 in a single night, but they remembered their grandfather started as a ferryboat operator. The money was spectacular. The pedigree was embarrassing. Europe offered a solution. Across the Atlantic, genuine aristocrats with genuine titles were quietly going bankrupt. Their estates required fortunes to maintain. Their agricultural incomes had collapsed, and their ancient bloodlines meant nothing to creditors. But they possessed the one thing American millionaires could not manufacture: centuries of unquestioned legitimacy. A duke was a duke because his great-great-great-grandfather had been a duke. No amount of railroad stock could purchase that kind of certainty. So began the Great Transatlantic Exchange. American heiresses married European noblemen in ceremonies that papered over the obvious transaction. The Vanderbilt daughter brought $2.5 million in railroad money. The English duke brought a title that transformed her from new money into the Duchess of Marlborough. Both families pretended this was romance. Both families knew it was commerce. By 1893, New York society had become obsessed with European validation. Genuine countesses received invitations that American-born women could not access, regardless of their bank accounts. A Russian prince, even an impoverished one, had commanded more social currency than the wealthiest department store magnate. The rules were unspoken but absolute. European nobility existed on a higher plane of human value, and association with them proved you belonged to that elevated world. This hunger created opportunity. Because if status depended on belief rather than verification, if a title mattered more than the person wearing it, if association with scandal touched royalty was more valuable than proven respectability, then the entire system was vulnerable to anyone brave enough to lie convincingly. All you needed was the costume, the accent, and absolute confidence that your audience wanted desperately to believe you. The question was not whether someone would attempt the fraud. The question was how long it would take before someone succeeded spectacularly. And the answer arrived in March of 1894, stepping off a steamship in New York Harbor, wearing a rented tiara and calling herself a countess. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Arrived with Nothing. When Countess Vera Cathcart stepped off the steamship in New York Harbor in March of 1894, she owned exactly 3 things: a forged passport, a rented tiara, and absolute confidence. Her real name was probably Sarah Wilson, though even that is uncertain. What we know for certain is that she was born in Ohio around 1868, worked as a milliner in Cincinnati until she was 24, and disappeared from city records in 1892. What happened in those missing 2 years transformed a hat maker into European nobility. She learned French and German well enough to curse in both. She studied the social registers and Burke's peerage until she could recite lineages from memory. She invented a dead husband, a fictional Count Cathcart, who had supposedly died in a hunting accident in Prussia, leaving her widowed, titled, and tragically beautiful. The preparation was meticulous. She knew that aristocratic manners were a language spoken in gestures too subtle for Americans to fully parse. The way you held a teacup, the angle of your chin when acknowledging an inferior, the studied indifference to wealth that only the genuinely wealthy could afford. She practiced these movements until they became reflex, until American observers would see not performance, but breeding. The tiara was rented from a Philadelphia jeweler under a false name, with a deposit paid in carefully saved wages. It was not particularly valuable, at perhaps $800 of paste and gilt, but it looked imperial under gaslight. And that was the genius of her approach. She understood that Americans could not distinguish real European nobility from performed European nobility because they had never been around enough of the genuine article to know the difference. Her entry strategy was calculated. She did not arrive announcing herself to the press or demanding recognition. Instead, she took rooms at a respectable but not extravagant hotel, the Waldorf, and began appearing in public spaces where society gathered: the opera, museum exhibitions, afternoon teas at the plaza. She dressed impeccably but not ostentatiously. She spoke little but listened beautifully, and she waited. Within a week, someone asked who she was. This was the critical moment. The Countess did not boast. She did not hand out calling cards. Instead, she looked faintly uncomfortable, as though her privacy had been invaded, and offered the barest details. A Russian title through her late husband, family estates near Moscow, currently entangled in legal complications following his death, temporary residence in New York while matters were settled. She delivered this information with a tone that suggested further questions would be rude. It worked. Because Americans had been trained to believe that genuine nobility did not seek attention, but rather endured it reluctantly. Her reticence proved her authenticity. Within 2 weeks, she had received her first invitation to a private dinner at a Fifth Avenue mansion. Within 4 weeks, she was being introduced at Mrs. Astor's Monday evening salon, the most exclusive gathering in New York society. The key to her performance was understanding what her audience wanted to see. They did not want a countess who was too friendly, too eager to fit in. That would suggest she needed them. Instead, they wanted someone who seemed faintly bemused by American customs, someone who had seen grander things in European courts and tolerated New York society with gracious patience. So she cultivated an air of elsewhere. She spoke of St. Petersburg as though it were more real than Manhattan. She referenced people and places her listeners had never heard of, knowing they would never admit their ignorance. By late April, she had become a fixture. Invitations arrived daily. Wealthy widowers sent flowers. Hostesses competed to secure her presence at their tables. And the Countess accepted it all with the gracious indifference of someone who had always been important and always would be. She had been in New York for 6 weeks. She had spent less than $300 of her own money, and she was about to begin stealing fortunes. But first, she needed access to the real prize, the jewelry that New York's wealthiest families kept in private safes, the diamonds and emeralds and sapphires they loaned to each other for balls and weddings, the portable wealth that could be borrowed with nothing but a signature and a title. Chapter 3. The 7-Week Kingdom. By late April, Countess Cathcart had invitations to 14 summer estates, 3 marriage proposals from millionaire widowers, and access to jewelry worth $800,000. The mechanics of her thefts were almost insultingly simple. She would mention to a hostess that she had been invited to a particularly important ball, but that her own jewels were locked in a European bank vault, inaccessible due to the legal complications surrounding her late husband's estate. The hostess, flattered to be confided in and eager to help a countess maintain appropriate appearances, would offer to loan something suitable. The countess would accept with reluctance, as though the gesture wounded her pride, but necessity demanded it. She borrowed a diamond necklace worth $50,000 from Mrs. Hamilton Fish to wear to the Metropolitan Opera. She borrowed emerald earrings valued at $32,000 from a Vanderbilt cousin for a private musicale. She borrowed a sapphire brooch, a ruby bracelet, and a pearl choker, and she never returned any of them. The genius was in the timing. She never kept jewelry from the same woman twice. She spaced the borrowings carefully, ensuring that weeks passed before anyone thought to ask for their property back. And when they did ask, she expressed horror and confusion. The necklace? She had returned it personally to Mrs. Fish's housekeeper 3 days after the opera. The emeralds? Given back to the Vanderbilt footman the very next morning. Surely there had been some confusion in the household staff. The victims faced an impossible choice. They could accuse a countess of theft, which meant admitting they had been foolish enough to loan valuable jewelry to a woman they barely knew. Or they could accept the loss quietly, blaming their own servants for the supposed confusion, and preserve their reputations as discerning judges of character. Most chose silence, but the jewelry was only part of the scheme. The real fortune came from loans. The Countess had established herself as a woman of substantial but temporarily inaccessible wealth. Her estate in Russia, she explained, generated $50,000 annually in rents and timber sales, but the funds could not be transferred to America during the legal proceedings. She needed temporary loans to maintain her position in society until matters were resolved. And because she was a countess, because she moved in the highest circles, because she had been vouched for by Mrs. Astor herself, men lined up to loan her money. She borrowed $20,000 from a banker at 6% interest, promising repayment within 90 days. She borrowed $15,000 from a railroad executive against the security of her fictional Russian estate. She borrowed $38,000 from a department store magnate who thought lending money to a countess might elevate his family's social standing. Each loan was documented with proper contracts and promissory notes. Each was secured against assets that did not exist. Each was given freely by men who considered themselves expert judges of financial risk. By early June, she had extracted over $120,000 in loans and stolen jewelry worth another $200,000. She lived in a rented mansion on Fifth Avenue, employed a staff of 12, and traveled in a private railroad car loaned by an admirer. She attended balls wearing stolen diamonds and dined with senators and industrial magnates who considered her friendship a mark of their own sophistication. She had reached the apex. The performance was flawless. The audience believed completely. And she knew, with the cold certainty that separates successful criminals from failed ones, that it could not last. Every con has a terminal velocity. The moment when the lies become too complex to maintain, when the debts exceed the available credit, when someone finally asks the question that has no good answer. For Countess Cathcart, that moment was approaching, but she had prepared for it. From the beginning, she had maintained an exit strategy. She had never unpacked all her belongings. She had kept her most valuable stolen pieces in a separate location and ready to be converted to cash and transported. She had studied train schedules and steamship departures because she understood that the art of the con was not just in the theft, it was in the escape. The summer estates were sending their invitations. The season's greatest ball was 3 weeks away, hosted by the Astors at their Newport mansion. The Countess had already borrowed the diamonds she would wear. She had already accepted loans she would never repay. And she had already decided exactly when she would disappear, but not yet. Because there was one final score, one last mark too perfect to resist, and she had 3 weeks to execute it before she vanished into myth. Chapter 4. The moment someone started asking questions. The first crack appeared not from a detective, but from a society columnist who noticed the Countess wore the same tiara to 3 consecutive events. Her name was Lila Worthington, and she wrote the social calendar column for the New York Herald under the byline, "The Watchful Eye." She attended every major ball, memorized every guest list, and had developed a nearly photographic memory for jewelry. The tiara bothered her. It was distinctive, a crescent design with small diamond clusters, and the Countess had worn it to the opera on May 3rd, to a private dinner on May 7th, and to a garden party on May 11th. This alone was not scandalous. But European nobility of the Countess's supposed rank typically owned multiple tiaras for different occasions. Wearing the same piece repeatedly suggested either sentimentality or financial limitation, and the Countess showed no signs of sentiment. Lila began watching more carefully. The emerald earrings at the Vanderbilt Musicale looked familiar. After consulting her notes, Lila confirmed she had seen identical earrings worn by Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II at a ball the previous season. The sapphire brooch the Countess wore to the theater matched one Lila had sketched in her notebook as belonging to Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish. The pearl choker appeared in her records as part of the Whitney family collection. Lila faced a problem. Accusing a countess of wearing borrowed or stolen jewelry required absolute certainty, and jewelry could be similar without being identical. She needed confirmation, so she did something both clever and dangerous. She approached Mrs. Fish at a private tea and complimented the stunning sapphire brooch she had seen the countess wearing. Mrs. Fish's face went carefully neutral. After a long pause, she said the brooch must have been a similar piece, as her own sapphire was currently being cleaned by her jeweler. Lila thanked her and moved on, but the hesitation told her everything. She began making discreet inquiries. A Vanderbilt cousin mentioned lending emerald earrings to the countess for a single evening. A railroad heiress confirmed loaning a diamond necklace that had not yet been returned, but surely would be soon. The women spoke carefully, protecting their own reputations, but the pattern was clear. The Countess was borrowing valuable jewelry and keeping it. Lila did not publish immediately. Instead, she began documenting more carefully. She noted that the Countess's Russian accent seemed inconsistent. Certain words were pronounced with Germanic inflections rather than Slavic ones. Her references to St. Petersburg society included names that did not appear in any European social register Lila could find. And when the Countess mentioned attending the coronation of Tsar Alexander III in 1883, Lila checked the date and discovered the Countess would have been 15 years old at the time, far too young to have attended such an event unless she was part of the imperial family itself, which she did not claim to be. The inconsistencies accumulated. A slip in conversation where the Countess referred to her late husband as having died in 1892, though she had previously said 1890. A claimed cousin in the Russian diplomatic service who, when contacted through official channels, denied any relation. A letter of introduction supposedly from a European banking house that used phrasing no European banker would write. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. A jeweler in Philadelphia read one of Lila's columns describing the Countess's tiara and contacted the Herald to say he had rented that exact piece to a woman named Sarah Wilson in February of 1894. The woman had paid a $50 deposit and promised to return it within 60 days. She had never come back. Lila now had enough to publish, but she made a calculation. If she exposed the Countess in print, the woman would flee immediately, and the victims would never recover their property. If she went to the police first, there might be a chance to arrest the Countess before she vanished. On June 14th, Lila took her evidence to the New York Police Department. Detective Thomas Burns reviewed the material and recognized what he had. This was not a simple jewel thief. This was a confidence artist operating at the highest levels of society, and her arrest would be spectacular. But it would also be delicate. The victims included some of the most powerful families in New York, and they would not appreciate being publicly identified as people foolish enough to be conned. Burns decided to move quickly, but quietly. He assigned 2 detectives to watch the Countess's mansion. He contacted several of the women who had loaned jewelry and asked them to formally report the thefts, and he began gathering evidence about the Countess's real identity. What he found was a woman who had meticulously erased her past. No Sarah Wilson matching her description appeared in Cincinnati census records. No Count Cathcart existed in European nobility registries. The letters of introduction were forgeries, the banking references were inventions, and the entire elaborate persona was built on nothing but performance and confidence. Meanwhile, the Countess continued her charade. She attended dinners, accepted more loans, and made plans for the Newport season. But something had shifted. Perhaps she sensed the increased scrutiny. Perhaps she noticed the detectives watching from across the street. Or perhaps she simply knew that 7 weeks of perfect performance was approaching its natural limit. On June 19th, she told her staff she would be spending the weekend at a friend's country estate. She packed a single trunk, took a hired carriage to Grand Central Terminal, and boarded a train to Boston. By the time Detective Burns obtained a warrant for her arrest on June 20th, she was already on a steamship bound for Liverpool, traveling under yet another false name. The jewelry she had stolen went with her, along with over $100,000 in cash from the loans she would never repay. She left behind a rented mansion full of furniture that did not belong to her, a staff who had not been paid in 2 weeks, and a collection of society matrons who would spend the next several months pretending they had never trusted her at all. The Countess had vanished, and in doing so, she had revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the world she left behind. That world had believed her not despite the inconsistencies, but because believing was more valuable than questioning. They had wanted a countess. She had given them one. And the fact that she was a fraud only mattered once she was gone. Chapter 5. The Heiress Who Never Existed. While police searched for Countess Cathcart, a 23-year-old woman named Cassie Chadwick walked into a Cleveland bank and claimed to be the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America. Cassie understood something the Countess had not fully exploited. Shame was a more powerful tool than greed. European nobility might impress society matrons, but it did not move bankers. Bankers wanted collateral, verification, documented assets. Unless you gave them a reason to skip verification entirely, unless you made verification itself seem like a betrayal of trust, unless you weaponized their desire to be the insider who handled a great man's secret. She had been preparing for years. Born Elizabeth Bigley in Ontario in 1857, she had already served prison time for forgery before reinventing herself as Cassie Hoover and marrying a wealthy Cleveland doctor named Leroy Chadwick in 1897. The marriage gave her respectability and access to banking circles. But she wanted more than a comfortable life as a doctor's wife. She wanted the kind of wealth that turned women into legends. The Carnegie scheme began with a visit to New York in March of 1902. Cassie arranged to be driven past Carnegie's mansion on Fifth Avenue in a hired carriage. She instructed the driver to stop, entered the mansion briefly, and emerged 15 minutes later carrying what appeared to be important documents. The driver, impressed by this apparent connection to Carnegie, later testified that Mrs. Chadwick had been received at the industrialist's private residence like family. In truth, Cassie had simply knocked on the door and asked to use the telephone, claiming her carriage had broken down. A servant let her into the entrance hall. She made a brief call and left. But the driver's testimony, delivered sincerely by a man who had no reason to lie, would become a cornerstone of her credibility. Back in Cleveland, Cassie began telling a careful story. She confided to her lawyer, a man named James Dillon, that she had a secret too shameful to reveal publicly. After much hesitation, she admitted the truth. She was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, the product of a youthful indiscretion during his time in Pittsburgh. Carnegie had acknowledged her privately and established a trust to support her, but public revelation would devastate his reputation and hurt his legitimate family. Dillon, sworn to secrecy, was shown documents that appeared to prove the claim. The documents were spectacular forgeries, promissory notes bearing Carnegie's signature, letters referring to "my dear daughter" and expressing paternal affection, a trust agreement establishing a $250,000 fund for her support. The papers looked authentic because Cassie had studied Carnegie's genuine signature from published business documents and practiced reproducing it for months. The trust agreement was written on legal stationery stolen from a Pittsburgh law firm, and the letters were aged with tea and creased to look handled. Dillon believed completely, and once he believed, he became her most effective advocate. Because when Cassie approached Cleveland Bank seeking loans, she brought Dillon as her lawyer. And Dillon, a respected attorney, vouched for her claims with the conviction of someone who had seen the proof himself. The first loan was for $10,000 from the Wade Park Banking Company, secured by a promissory note supposedly signed by Andrew Carnegie. The bank president, Charles Beckwith, faced a decision. He could demand verification, which meant contacting Carnegie directly and potentially exposing an illegitimate daughter, ruining his relationship with the Carnegie family if the story was true. Or he could accept the note based on Dylan's testimony and Cassie's obvious connections. Beckwith made the calculation that destroyed him. If this woman was truly Carnegie's daughter, and if he helped her discreetly, he would become the trusted banker to one of America's most powerful families. The potential reward far outweighed the risk. He approved the loan. The second loan was easier. Cassie returned to Wade Park 6 months later, requesting $25,000. Beckwith, already committed to believing her, approved it immediately. Then came $50,000 from the Citizens National Bank. Then $75,000 from a private lender who heard about the Carnegie connection and wanted access to that world. Each loan referenced the sealed promissory notes that no one ever actually verified. Each banker calculated that being the man who handled Carnegie's secret was worth more than the man who exposed it. By 1904, Cassie had borrowed over $250,000 from multiple banks, all secured by Carnegie's supposed promises to provide for his illegitimate daughter. She lived in a mansion on Euclid Avenue, employed a staff of 20, and wore jewelry worth $30,000. She donated generously to charities, establishing herself as a philanthropist with mysterious but clearly substantial resources. The con worked because it exploited multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. Bankers wanted to be insiders. They wanted to believe they had been chosen to handle sensitive family matters for powerful men. They wanted the status that came from association with Carnegie, even if that association had to remain secret. And most critically, they knew that asking Carnegie to verify the story meant admitting they had loaned significant sums based on potentially false claims. The shame of being fooled was worse than the risk of never being certain. Cassie understood this. She cultivated an air of vulnerable trust, confiding in bankers as though they were protecting her from a cruel world that would judge her for her father's sin. She made them complicit in her victimhood. And she knew that once they had approved the first loan, every subsequent loan was easier because backing out meant admitting the first had been a mistake. But unlike the Countess, who had planned her escape from the beginning, Cassie made a fatal error. She believed her own performance. She began to think that she could sustain the lie indefinitely, that the bankers were too invested to ever demand verification. She borrowed more and more, growing reckless, until the amounts became too large to ignore. In October of 1904, Wade Park Banking Company faced a crisis. The bank had extended too much credit, and federal examiners were demanding documentation of outstanding loans. They wanted to see the Carnegie promissory notes. Beckwith stalled, but he could not stall forever. On November 1st, he sent a telegram to Andrew Carnegie's office asking for confirmation that the notes were genuine. And then Cassie's kingdom began to collapse. Chapter 6: The Day Carnegie Finally Spoke. On November 7th, 1904, Andrew Carnegie released a single sentence to the press: "I have no daughter, legitimate or otherwise." The statement appeared in newspapers across the country within hours. 7 words that destroyed an empire built on secrets and shame. Carnegie did not elaborate. He did not express outrage or demand prosecution. He simply stated a fact, and that fact was enough. Cassie was in New York when the news broke. She had traveled there to secure another loan, this time from a Manhattan bank that specialized in serving wealthy women. She was sitting in the bank president's office when a clerk entered with the afternoon edition of the Herald. The banker read Carnegie's statement, looked at Cassie, and stood without speaking. The meeting was over. She returned to her hotel and began destroying documents, letters, promissory notes, in anything that could be used as evidence. But it was futile. The banks in Cleveland already had copies. The lawyers already had testimony. And Carnegie's denial had eliminated the one weapon that had protected her, the fear of embarrassing a powerful man. Within 24 hours, Wade Park Banking Company filed a criminal complaint against Cassie Chadwick for fraud. Citizens National Bank followed, then a private lender, then another bank, until 7 separate institutions had filed charges involving loans totaling over $200,000. Arrest warrants were issued. Federal marshals were dispatched. Cassie did not run immediately. She returned to Cleveland and attempted to salvage the situation. She claimed Carnegie was lying to protect his reputation. She said she had documents that would prove her claims. She hired lawyers and prepared to fight. But the legal strategy fell apart the moment experts examined the promissory notes. The signatures were forgeries. The paper was too new. The legal language was wrong. Every document she had used as collateral was fake. On December 8, 1904, federal marshals arrested Cassie Chadwick at her Euclid Avenue mansion. They found closets full of gowns worth thousands of dollars, jewelry that had never been paid for, and financial records showing she had spent over $300,000 in less than 3 years. They also found something that revealed the scope of her ambition: draft promissory notes bearing forged signatures from J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Henry Clay Frick. She had not been content with Carnegie. She had been planning to expand the con to every industrial magnate in America. The arrest triggered a financial panic. Wade Park Banking Company, having extended over $100,000 in fraudulent loans, faced insolvency. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Within a week, the bank collapsed completely, wiping out the savings of hundreds of Cleveland families. The bank president, Charles Beckwith, suffered a nervous breakdown. He would die less than a year later, his reputation destroyed, his family's fortune gone. Other victims emerged. A physician who had loaned Cassie $20,000 for what she claimed was a temporary investment opportunity. A jewelry store owner who had provided $50,000 worth of diamonds on credit. A railroad executive who had given her access to private cars and secured loans based on her supposed Carnegie connection. Each had believed because believing offered the promise of access to power. Each now faced ruin. The press coverage was savage. Newspapers published details of the forged documents, the lavish spending, the lies told to bankers and lawyers. But the coverage also revealed an uncomfortable truth. The victims had wanted to believe. They had ignored obvious inconsistencies because the Carnegie connection was too valuable to question. One editorial in the Cleveland Plain Dealer noted that the real crime was not Mrs. Chadwick's fraud, but the greed and vanity of men who should have known better. Cassie's trial was scheduled for March of 1905. She spent the intervening months in custody, and during that time, something shifted in the public narrative. Initial outrage gave way to a kind of grudging fascination. Here was a woman, born poor, with no formal education, who had convinced some of the most sophisticated financiers in America to hand over fortunes based on nothing but performance and confidence. The newspapers began calling her the Queen of Swindlers. Some writers framed her as a folk hero who had exposed the hypocrisy of a system that valued connections over competence. But this romanticization ignored the real victims, the Cleveland families who lost their savings when Wade Park collapsed, the small business owners who had extended credit and would never be repaid, the doctor whose life savings vanished into Cassie's wardrobe. These people were not greedy bankers or social climbers. They were ordinary people caught in the blast radius of a spectacular fraud. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Countess Cathcart was rumored to be living in Paris under a new name. Detectives had tracked her to Liverpool, then lost her trail in London. There were unconfirmed sightings in Vienna, Monte Carlo, and Rome. Each time authorities closed in, she vanished again. Unlike Cassie, who had stayed too long and believed her own myth, the Countess understood that the art of the con was knowing exactly when to walk away. The parallel was instructive. Both women had exploited the same fundamental weakness, the desire of their victims to be special, to be insiders, to have access to worlds beyond their reach. But their fates diverged based on a single variable. The Countess had maintained emotional distance from her own performance. She had never confused the role with reality. Cassie had fallen in love with being Carnegie's daughter, had started to believe that the mansions and jewels and deference were truly hers, and that belief had destroyed her. Chapter 7. What the Trials Revealed. Cassie Chadwick's trial lasted 9 days and exposed something far more embarrassing than her fraud: how desperately bankers and businessmen wanted to believe they were special enough to handle a tycoon's secret. The trial began on March 6, 1905, in the United States District Court in Cleveland. The prosecution called 42 witnesses. The defense called none. Cassie sat in the courtroom wearing a black dress and veil, occasionally dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, performing grief and betrayal. Her lawyer argued that she was the real victim, seduced by promises from powerful men and then abandoned when the truth became inconvenient. The jury did not believe her, but the testimony revealed something more complex than simple fraud. Charles Beckwith, the former president of Wade Park Banking Company, took the stand on day 3. He looked 20 years older than his actual age of 56. His hands shook as he was sworn in. The prosecutor asked him why he had approved loans totaling $103,000 without verifying the Carnegie promissory notes. Beckwith's answer was devastating in its honesty. "I believed," he said, "that being the banker who handled such sensitive family matters would elevate my institution above all others in Cleveland. I believed that once Mr. Carnegie's legal affairs were settled, and he would transfer his business to our bank out of gratitude. I believed that the risk of offending him by demanding verification outweighed the risk of the loans themselves." The prosecutor pressed. Had Beckwith ever attempted to contact Carnegie to confirm the relationship? "No, Mrs. Chadwick specifically requested that I not do so. She said her father's reputation depended on absolute discretion. And I thought, if I was the man who could be trusted with such discretion, what doors that would open." The courtroom was silent, because Beckwith had just articulated the psychology that made the entire con possible. He had not been fooled by documents or forged signatures. He had been fooled by his own ambition. The con worked because he wanted it to work. Other bankers testified with similar admissions. Albert Anderson, who approved $75,000 in loans from Citizens National Bank, said he had been impressed by Cassie's confidence and her obvious wealth. "She lived like Carnegie's daughter," he explained. "The mansion, the servants, the charitable donations. It seemed impossible that someone would go to such expense to perpetrate a fraud. This was the second psychological vulnerability Cassie had exploited, the circular logic of wealth as proof of legitimacy. Because she spent money like a Carnegie, people assumed she had access to Carnegie money, and once they made that assumption, they gave her actual money, which allowed her to spend more, which reinforced the assumption. The con was self-sustaining until someone demanded proof. The lawyer James Dillon testified on day 5. He had been disbarred and was facing his own criminal charges for his role in vouching for Cassie's claims. He described seeing the documents, the letters from Carnegie, the trust agreements. He had believed they were genuine because they looked genuine, and because Cassie had shown them to him in confidence, making him feel like a trusted insider. "Did you ever verify the signatures?" the prosecutor asked. "I had no reason to doubt them," Dillon said. Mrs. Chadwick was clearly a woman of substantial means. Her husband was a respected physician, and she had been received at Carnegie's residence in New York. The driver testified to that. "But you did not verify the signatures?" "No." "Why not?" Dillon paused. "Because verifying meant not trusting, and Mrs. Chadwick had trusted me with her deepest secret. To respond with suspicion felt ungentlemanly." This was the third weapon, social convention. Cassie had framed verification as an act of rudeness, a violation of the trust between lawyer and client, banker and customer, gentleman and lady. She had made due diligence seem like an insult, and these men, trained to value their reputations as trustworthy professionals, had chosen trust over verification. The prosecution also revealed the extent of Cassie's spending. In 3 years, she had burned through over $300,000, $40,000 on jewelry, $60,000 on clothing and accessories, $80,000 on household expenses for a mansion she did not own, $30,000 in charitable donations designed to establish her as a philanthropist. The rest disappeared into investments that never materialized and loans to associates who never repaid her. The defense attempted to argue that Cassie genuinely believed she was entitled to Carnegie's support, that she had been led to believe the relationship was real. But this argument collapsed when prosecutors presented the draft promissory notes found in her home, bearing forged signatures from multiple industrial magnates. This was not the behavior of a deluded woman. This was the behavior of a criminal planning to scale her operation. On March 14th, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Cassie Chadwick was sentenced to 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary, the maximum allowed by law. The judge, Francis Wing, delivered a statement before sentencing. "You exploited not just the greed of your victims, but their better natures, their desire to be discreet, their willingness to trust, their adherence to social convention. You weaponized decency itself." The victim's response was complex. Publicly, many expressed relief at justice being served. Privately, most wanted the entire matter forgotten. The shame of being identified as someone foolish enough to fall for such an obvious fraud was worse than the financial loss. Several families quietly left Cleveland to avoid the continued association with the scandal. But the trial also triggered a broader conversation. Newspaper editorials questioned why wealthy, educated men had been so easily deceived. Some blamed American reverence for European aristocracy and industrial fortunes, and arguing that democratic society should not create untouchable aristocratic classes. Others blamed the victim's greed and vanity. A few voices, mostly women writing in progressive publications, suggested that society's willingness to believe. Cassie revealed how little power women were typically allowed to have. Perhaps these men had been fooled because they could not imagine a woman being competent enough to execute such sophisticated fraud. This last observation was closest to the truth. Cassie, like the Countess before her, had understood that being underestimated was an advantage. Men assumed women were emotional, impractical, incapable of complex financial schemes. So when a woman presented herself as Carnegie's vulnerable daughter, seeking help from strong, protective men, those men never considered that the vulnerability might be performance. They saw what they expected to see: a woman who needed them. The trial ended. Cassie was transported to prison, and the question everyone asked was whether this would be the last such fraud, or whether somewhere another woman was studying the case, learning from Cassie's mistakes, and preparing to execute an even more audacious con. The answer came faster than anyone expected. But Chapter 8, The Mystic and the Millionaire's Widow. As Chadwick sat in prison, a third woman was executing perhaps the most audacious con of all, convincing a Vanderbilt widow that she could communicate with her dead husband. Her name was Anne Odelia Dis DeBar, though she had used at least 17 other names across 3 continents. Born in Kentucky in 1849, she had worked as a fake medium since she was 16, moving from city to city as local authorities caught up with her scams. By 1905, she had refined spiritualism into a precision instrument for extracting money from the grieving wealthy. The spiritualist movement had grown explosively in America during the late 1800s. Millions believed the dead could communicate with the living through gifted intermediaries called mediums. Seances became social events in fashionable parlors. Wealthy families paid substantial fees for private sessions with mediums who claimed to channel departed loved ones. And while some practitioners genuinely believed in their abilities, others recognized spiritualism as the perfect con. The marks wanted desperately to believe. Verification was impossible, and questioning the medium meant questioning your faith in the afterlife itself. Anne Odelia specialized in targeting wealthy widows. She understood that grief made people vulnerable in ways greed never could. A banker might eventually question a financial scheme, but a widow desperate to hear her husband's voice one more time would suspend all skepticism if the performance was good enough. Her target was Mrs. Luther Marsh, widow of a successful New York lawyer who had died in 1903, leaving an estate worth approximately $150,000. Mrs. Marsh was 68 years old, childless, isolated by grief, and haunted by the traditional widow's guilt. Things left unsaid, reconciliations never attempted, a final conversation denied by sudden death. Anne Odelia began carefully. She attended the same church as Mrs. Marsh and arranged to be introduced through mutual acquaintances. She mentioned casually that she had certain sensitivities, that she sometimes perceived things others could not. She did not claim to be a medium. She simply let the suggestion hang in the air. Mrs. Marsh, intrigued, invited Anne Odelia to tea. During the conversation, Anne Odelia paused mid-sentence and said, "Forgive me, but I sense a presence, a man, someone who cares for you very deeply." She described vague details that could apply to almost any deceased husband: devotion to his work, concern for his wife's well-being, regret over time not spent together. Mrs. Marsh began to cry. The hook was set. The first formal séance occurred in Mrs. Marsh's Fifth Avenue parlor on a November evening in 1905, and Anne Odelia arrived with an associate, a young woman she introduced as her assistant. They arranged the room carefully, heavy curtains drawn, a single candle, a small table with chairs positioned close together. Anne Odelia explained that spirits communicated more easily in darkness and intimacy. What Mrs. Marsh did not know was that Anne Odelia had spent weeks researching her background. She had interviewed former servants, read old society columns, and pieced together details about Luther Marsh's life and personality. She knew his business partners, his favorite restaurants, his habit of reading late into the night. She had stolen letters from Mrs. Marsh's study during an earlier visit, memorizing intimate details mentioned in the correspondence. The séance began with Anne Odelia entering a supposed trance. She swayed, moaned softly, and then spoke in a deeper voice, claiming to be Luther Marsh. The spirit thanked his wife for her years of devotion. He mentioned specific memories, a trip to Newport in 1897, a disagreement about redecorating the library, a private joke about Mrs. Marsh's sister, details that seemed impossible for a stranger to know. Mrs. Marsh was convinced. She wept, she asked questions, and Anne Odelia, speaking as the spirit, provided comforting answers. The husband was at peace. He watched over her. He wanted her to be happy. The session lasted 90 minutes and left Mrs. Marsh emotionally devastated, but also grateful. She paid Anne Odelia $100 for the session. The seances continued weekly. Each time, Anne Odelia revealed more intimate details, cementing Mrs. Marsh's belief. And gradually, she introduced the financial component. The spirit expressed concern about his wife's investments. He wanted to ensure her security. He had insights about business opportunities, guidance from beyond the veil about which stocks to buy and which to sell. This was the genius of Anne Odelia's approach. She was not just selling spiritual comfort. She was positioning herself as a conduit for financial advice, supposedly coming from a man Mrs. Marsh had trusted in life. If Luther Marsh had been a shrewd investor when alive, surely his guidance was even more valuable now that he existed in a realm beyond earthly limitations. Mrs. Marsh began following the spirit's investment advice, channeled through Anne Odelia. Some investments succeeded, often because Anne Odelia had done enough research to make educated guesses about market trends. Some failed, which Anne Odelia blamed on Mrs. Marsh not following the spirit's instructions precisely. Either way, Mrs. Marsh's faith deepened. By 1906, Anne Odelia had convinced Mrs. Marsh to make more direct investments. The spirit wanted to fund charitable work in his name. He wanted to support spiritualist research that would prove the existence of the afterlife to skeptics. He wanted to establish a foundation that would help other grieving widows find peace through communication with their departed husbands. These projects required funding. Mrs. Marsh wrote check after check, $20,000 for the charitable foundation that existed only on forged incorporation documents, $15,000 for spiritualist research that was never conducted, $30,000 for a building that would house a center for spiritual studies, a building that was never purchased. Over 18 months, Anne Odelia extracted $75,000 from Mrs. Marsh, all supposedly directed by the spirit of Luther Marsh himself. But Anne Odelia made two critical errors. First, she grew greedy and impatient. She began pushing for larger sums more frequently, creating urgency where none should exist. Spirits, after all, had eternity. Why would they need money quickly? Second, she relied too heavily on her research, rather than limiting herself to vague generalities. She told Mrs. Marsh specific details about her husband's business dealings that seemed impressively accurate, but could be verified. The breaking point came in March of 1907. During a seance, the spirit told Mrs. Marsh that he had left a secret will with a trusted law partner, a man named Harrison Boyle, establishing an additional trust for her benefit. Mrs. Marsh should contact Boyle to claim what was rightfully hers. This was the fatal mistake, because Harrison Boyle had never existed. Anne Odelia had invented him, assuming Mrs. Marsh would not verify the claim. But grief had not completely destroyed Mrs. Marsh's faculties. She contacted her late husband's actual law partners and asked about Boyle. They told her no such person had ever worked at the firm. For the first time in 18 months, Mrs. Marsh questioned the spirits. She questioned Anne Odelia, and once doubt entered her mind, the entire edifice of belief began to crumble. She started reviewing the financial requests, the investments that had never materialized, the foundation that had no visible presence. She hired a private investigator. What the investigator found was devastating. The charitable foundation was a rented post office box. The Spiritualist Research Center did not exist. The building for spiritual studies had never been purchased. Anne Odelia had deposited Mrs. Marsh's checks into personal accounts and spent the money on expensive clothes, jewelry, and rent for a mansion she claimed was a spiritual retreat center, but was actually her private residence. More damaging still, the investigator discovered Anne Odelia's hidden research room in a rented office downtown. The room contained stolen letters, copied documents, and meticulously maintained files on 23 wealthy New York families. Each file included family trees, business connections, details about deceased relatives, and notes on which widows seemed most vulnerable to spiritualist fraud. Anne Odelia had not been channeling spirits. She had been running a research operation. Mrs. Marsh faced the same choice every con victim faces: admit she had been fooled and pursue justice, or stay silent and preserve dignity. Unlike the society matrons who had loaned jewelry to Countess Cathcart, unlike the bankers who had funded Cassie Chadwick, Mrs. Marsh chose exposure. On April 3, 1907, she filed a criminal complaint against Anne Odelia DeBar for fraud and theft. Chapter 9. The Night the Ghosts Stopped Speaking. The mystic's downfall came when she made a fatal error. She told the widow something about her husband that the widow knew was impossible. The arrest warrant was issued on April 4th. Police arrived at Anne Odelia's mansion to find her preparing to flee. Trunks were packed. Tickets for a steamship to England were purchased for departure the following day. She had sensed the danger, just not quickly enough. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The stolen letters alone guaranteed conviction. But Mrs. Marsh wanted more than legal justice. She wanted public vindication. She wanted other grieving widows to understand how the con worked so they could not be similarly exploited. So she insisted on a trial rather than accepting a guilty plea. The trial began in May of 1907 and became a sensation. The courtroom was packed with spiritualists defending Anne Odelia as a genuine medium being persecuted by materialists, and with skeptics eager to see spiritualism itself put on trial. The testimony revealed the mechanics of the fraud in excruciating detail. The investigator described the research room. He showed the jury files containing information about Mrs. Marsh's family that could only have been obtained through theft and surveillance. He presented receipts showing Anne Odelia had spent $73,000 in 18 months on personal expenses, while claiming the money funded charitable work. Former servants testified that Anne Odelia had bribed them to provide information about their employers. A locksmith admitted making keys that allowed her to access homes when families were away. A theatrical supply company confirmed selling her equipment used in seances. Speaking tubes concealed in walls, mechanisms for moving objects in darkness, phosphorescent paint for creating glowing manifestations. But the most damaging testimony came from Anne Odelia's former assistant, the young woman who had attended the seances. Granted immunity in exchange for cooperation, she described exactly how the fraud worked. She had been hidden in adjacent rooms, speaking through concealed tubes to create the voice of spirits. She had researched families and fed information to Anne Odelia before seances. She had stolen letters and documents that Anne Odelia later referenced as proof of genuine spiritual contact. "Did you ever believe you were actually communicating with the dead?" the prosecutor asked. "No," the assistant said. "It was a performance, a very good performance, but always a performance." The defense attempted to argue that Anne Odelia genuinely possessed spiritual gifts and that any financial arrangements were legitimate compensation for her services. But this argument collapsed when prosecutors demonstrated that many of the supposed spiritual investments had been entirely fabricated. The charitable foundation existed only on paper. The research center had never been established. The money had gone directly into Anne Odelia's personal accounts. Mrs. Marsh testified on the 6th day of the trial. She described her grief after her husband's death, her desperate desire to believe he still existed in some form, and how Anne Odelia had exploited that desperation. She spoke about the relief she had felt during the seances, the comfort of hearing her husband's voice, and the guidance she thought she was receiving. And then she described the moment of realization. "When the spirit mentioned Harrison Boyle, I knew something was wrong. My husband and I had been married for 43 years. I knew every colleague he had ever worked with. There was no Harrison Boyle. And if the spirits could lie about that, what else had been a lie?" She paused, composing herself. "I realized I had been speaking to Mrs. DeBar the entire time. Not my husband, not spirits, just a woman who had researched my life and told me what I wanted to hear." The courtroom was silent, because Mrs. Marsh had articulated something profound about the nature of belief and deception. She had not been fooled by tricks and hidden tubes. She had been fooled by her own desire. But Anne Odelia had simply provided the framework for that self-deception. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Anne Odelia DeBar was sentenced to 6 years in prison for fraud and theft. The judge noted that while the financial crime was serious, the emotional manipulation was perhaps worse. "You preyed on grief," he said. "You turned mourning into a commodity and suffering into profit." But the trial's impact extended beyond Anne Odelia's conviction. It triggered a national conversation about spiritualism and the vulnerability of the grieving. Newspapers published exposés on fake mediums. Reform movements called for regulation of spiritualist practices. Some states passed laws requiring mediums to register with authorities and disclose that their services were for entertainment purposes only. Yet spiritualism did not die. Believers argued that the existence of frauds did not disprove genuine spiritual phenomena, just as counterfeit money did not disprove the existence of real currency. They continued attending seances, continued seeking communication with the dead, continued funding mediums who promised connection to the beyond. Anne Odelia served 4 years of her sentence before being released for good behavior in 1911. She disappeared from public records after her release. Some claimed she returned to spiritualist fraud under a new name. Others said she retired to obscurity, her reputation too damaged to continue the con. Unlike Countess Cathcart, who had vanished at the peak of her success, Anne Odelia left prison broken, exposed, and forgotten. The three women, the Countess, Cassie Chadwick, and Anne Odelia, represented three different approaches to the same fundamental con: exploiting the gap between what people wanted to believe and what was actually true. The Countess had sold status, Cassie had sold lineage, Anne Odelia had sold comfort. All three had understood that the most valuable commodity in Gilded Age America was not money, but meaning. Association with nobility gave meaning to new wealth. Connection to Carnegie gave meaning to social ambition. Contact with the dead gave meaning to grief. And all three had discovered the same truth. The con collapsed not when victims questioned the lie, but when they could no longer afford to believe it. And as long as the Countess provided access to high society, her origins did not matter. As long as Cassie's story explained access to Carnegie's wealth, the details remained unverified. As long as Anne Odelia offered connection to a dead husband, the methods were unexamined. The victims had been complicit in their own deception because believing was more valuable than knowing. Chapter 10. What happened to the women? Cassie Chadwick died in prison in 1907, never revealing where she hid the money. The Countess was never caught. The mystic vanished after posting bail. Cassie collapsed in her cell at the Ohio State Penitentiary on October 10, 1907. She had served 2.5 years of her 10-year sentence. The official cause of death was heart failure, though prison doctors noted she had been in declining health since her incarceration. She was 50 years old. In her final months, Cassie had received hundreds of letters from people fascinated by her story. Some condemned her as a criminal. Others praised her as a woman who had beaten the system, even temporarily. A few begged for advice on executing similar cons. She answered none of them. When prison authorities searched her cell after her death, they found no hidden money, no secret accounts, no indication of where the $300,000 she had stolen had gone. Some speculated she had given it to associates who were never identified. Others believed she had spent it all, burning through a fortune in 3 years of extravagant living. The most romantic theory suggested she had hidden it somewhere, planning to retrieve it after her release, but death had made the location a permanent secret. The funeral was attended by 3 people: her husband, Dr. Leroy Chadwick, who had divorced her during the trial but still paid for burial expenses, a prison chaplain, and a newspaper reporter hoping for a deathbed confession that never came. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a Cleveland cemetery. No stone marked the location of the woman who had convinced bankers she was Carnegie's daughter. Her estate, when settled, contained exactly $14.37 in personal property. The victims of her fraud recovered nothing. Wade Park Banking Company, which had collapsed during the scandal, never reopened. The families who lost their savings in the bank's failure never received compensation. Cassie had destroyed fortunes and walked into her grave without restitution or remorse. The Countess, meanwhile, had vanished into the mythology of unsolved crimes. Detective Thomas Burns had tracked her to Liverpool in June of 1894, but lost her trail in London. Over the next decade, there were rumored sightings across Europe. A woman matching her description was seen in Paris in 1895, living in a modest apartment and working as a seamstress. Another sighting placed her in Vienna in 1897, married to an Austrian merchant. A third report claimed she was in Rome in 1902, teaching English to wealthy Italian families. None of these sightings were confirmed. The Countess had disappeared so completely that some theorized she had died shortly after fleeing New York, and the subsequent sightings were cases of mistaken identity. Others believed she had executed the perfect escape, abandoning her false identity entirely and living out her life as someone new. What we know for certain is that the jewelry she stole was never recovered. The loans she took were never repaid. And the society matrons who had welcomed her into their circles spent years afterward wondering if they had passed her on a European street without recognizing her. The woman who had performed aristocracy so flawlessly had simply stepped off stage and vanished into the audience. Anne Odelia Dis de Bar was released from prison in 1911 after serving 4 years of her 6-year sentence. She was 62 years old, her health ruined by incarceration, her reputation destroyed. Unlike Cassie, who had maintained defiance until death, or the Countess, who had escaped entirely, Anne Odelia left prison defeated. She attempted to return to spiritualism under the name Madame Dis de Bar, offering private readings to clients who did not know her criminal history. But her notoriety was too great. Newspapers published her photograph alongside warnings about the convicted fraud. Former clients recognized her and reported her to authorities. Within 6 months, she had been arrested twice more for fraud, though both cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence. By 1912, Anne Odelia had disappeared from public records. There are no confirmed sightings after that year, no death certificate, no final accounting of her life. She simply faded into obscurity, one more elderly woman in a city full of the forgotten. The asymmetry of their fates was striking. The Countess, who had committed the cleanest fraud and escaped at the optimal moment, lived free and possibly comfortable. Cassie, who had grown reckless and believed her own performance, died in prison. Anne Odelia, who had targeted the most vulnerable victims, survived prison only to live in poverty and obscurity. There was no justice in the distribution of consequences, only the random mathematics of timing and luck. The money they stole, collectively over $500,000 in early 1900s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 million today, was never fully accounted for. Some was spent on the performances that sustained the cons, the mansions, the jewelry, the charitable donations that established credibility. Some disappeared into the pockets of associates and accomplices who were never identified. And some simply vanished, hidden in accounts or locations that died with the women who created them. The victims, meanwhile, faced their own reckonings. Some rebuilt their fortunes, others never recovered financially or socially. The shame of being publicly identified as someone foolish enough to be conned proved more damaging than the actual financial loss. Several families left New York entirely to escape the association with scandal. Others stayed, but found themselves subtly excluded from social circles where trust had been broken. And somewhere in the collective memory of Gilded Age society, these 3 women became cautionary tales. Not warnings about the existence of fraud, but warnings about the dangers of wanting to believe. Because the real lesson was not that con artists were clever. It was that their victims had been willing participants in their own deception, blinded by greed, status, or grief, until the moment when belief became impossible to sustain. Chapter 11. How Society Changed Its Guard. By 1910, every major social club in New York had hired private investigators to verify titles, and European genealogy suddenly became a booming American business. The scandals had done what years of social reform could not. They had made the upper class paranoid. The casual trust that had allowed Countess Cathcart to borrow diamonds and Cassie Chadwick to secure loans based on claimed connections was replaced by systematic verification. If you claimed nobility, prove it. If you referenced powerful relatives, document it. If you wanted access to wealth, demonstrate your own. The professionalization of social gatekeeping began with the social clubs. The Metropolitan Club, the Union Club, the Colony Club, all hired investigators to research prospective members. These were not amateur inquiries. They were systematic background checks conducted by former police detectives and Pinkerton agents. Every claimed title was verified through Burke's Peerage or the Almanac de Gotha. Every family connection was documented. Every financial claim was investigated. A new industry emerged: genealogical verification services. Firms established offices in New York, London, and Paris, offering to trace lineages and confirm noble titles for fees ranging from $500 to $5,000. American families paid these fees willingly, preferring the expense of verification to the embarrassment of being fooled. The social secretaries who managed calling lists and invitations for wealthy families became professional screeners. They maintained detailed files on everyone who moved in society circles, where they came from, who vouched for them, what their actual financial situation was. The casual spontaneity of Gilded Age entertaining, where a charming stranger could talk their way into a ballroom, was replaced by bureaucratic precision. Even the practice of loaning jewelry changed. Insurance companies began requiring documentation of borrowed pieces. Families started demanding collateral or deposits before allowing others to wear their valuables. The informal system of trust that had allowed the Countess to accumulate hundreds of thousands in stolen diamonds was replaced by contracts, receipts, and legal agreements. Banks implemented new lending protocols. No loan above $10,000 could be approved without verification of collateral. Claims of family connections to wealthy individuals required documentation signed by those individuals. References from attorneys or business associates were checked directly. The casual loan culture that had allowed Cassie Chadwick to extract fortunes based on sealed envelopes supposedly containing Carnegie's promises was systematically dismantled. Ironically, these reforms made high society more exclusive and rigid than ever before. In the very institutions that had been exploited by con artists, responded by building higher walls and more elaborate gatekeeping mechanisms. It became nearly impossible for anyone without documented wealth or verified lineage to enter elite circles, regardless of their actual merit or character. The reforms also revealed an uncomfortable truth. The system had always been based on verification avoidance. The whole point of Gilded Age society was to create a world where the right connections and the right performance were more valuable than documented achievement. Forcing verification meant admitting that breeding and status could be faked, which undermined the entire premise that made these markers meaningful. Some social critics argued that the con artists had done society a service by exposing the arbitrary nature of class distinctions. If a milliner from Ohio could become a countess through pure performance, what did that say about the genuine countesses? If Cassie Chadwick could convince bankers she was Carnegie's daughter, what did that reveal about how Carnegie's actual relatives were treated? The cons had demonstrated that status was always performance, always subject to belief, always vulnerable to those who understood the system well enough to manipulate it. But these philosophical questions mattered less than the practical result. By 1910, the age of the successful society con artist was over. The mechanisms of verification had become too sophisticated, the paranoia too deep, the walls too high. Future frauds would need to operate in different arenas with different strategies. The professionalization of gatekeeping also created new opportunities for class mobility to be denied. Without the possibility of performing your way into elite circles, the barriers between social classes became more permanent. The fluidity that had allowed some genuinely talented individuals to rise based on charm and competence was eliminated along with the frauds. Society became safer from deception, but also more calcified, more resistant to change. By 1920, the verification industry had become institutionalized. Social registers published by firms like the Social Register Association provided official lists of acceptable families. Genealogists offered certification services. Private investigators specialized in background checks for social purposes. The informal and trust-based system that had governed Gilded Age society was replaced by a formal, documented hierarchy. And yet, the fundamental hunger that had made the cons possible remained. American families still craved European validation. Wealthy individuals still wanted to believe they had access to secrets and connections that elevated them above others. Grieving widows still sought comfort from spiritualists promising connection to the dead. The desire had not changed. Only the difficulty of exploiting it had increased. The legacy of the three con artists was this: they had forced society to acknowledge its own vulnerabilities. They had revealed that wealth did not guarantee wisdom, that breeding did not ensure discernment, that status could not protect against manipulation. And in doing so, they had triggered reforms that made the upper class more insular, more defensive, and ultimately more aware of how fragile their position truly was. Chapter 12. The Con That Never Ends. More than a century later, we still cannot agree on what these women were: brilliant criminals, feminist rebels against a corrupt system, or simply thieves who understood their marks too well. The ambiguity is deliberate, because how we interpret their stories reveals what we believe about ambition, performance, and the construction of identity in a society obsessed with bloodlines and titles. The Countess, Cassie Chadwick, and Anne Odelia Disty-Barr committed fraud. That is legally and morally clear. But they also exposed something profound about the systems they exploited. Consider what they revealed about Gilded Age society, and that status was entirely performative, based on nothing more substantial than collective agreement to believe certain signals mattered. That the wealthy were not more discerning than anyone else, just more invested in maintaining the illusion of their own superiority. That American aristocrats, for all their mansions and servants and charitable foundations, were desperately insecure about their legitimacy compared to European nobility. The con artists understood something that legitimate society preferred to ignore. Class was always performance. The genuine countesses were performing nobility just as much as the fake ones. The difference was merely that genuine countesses had been performing from birth and had family wealth to support the illusion. But strip away the inherited money and the documented lineage, and what remained was simply a woman who had learned to hold a teacup at the correct angle and speak with the appropriate accent. This realization is uncomfortable because it suggests that merit and authenticity matter less than we want to believe. The Countess was not less skilled at being a countess than a genuine Russian aristocrat. In fact, she was arguably more skilled because she had to learn consciously what others absorbed unconsciously. Cassie Chadwick was not less capable than Carnegie's actual relatives at managing wealth and commanding respect. She simply lacked the legal documentation that transformed performance into legitimacy. Some feminist historians have framed these women as rebels against a system that denied them legitimate paths to power. In the 1890s, women could not vote. Could not control their own property after marriage in many states, and had severely limited professional opportunities. The only socially acceptable ways for women to access wealth were through marriage or inheritance. The con artists rejected that limitation and created their own paths to power through intelligence and performance. This interpretation has merit, but also limits. Yes, these women operated in a system that constrained female ambition, but they also hurt real people. The families who lost savings when Wade Park Banking Company collapsed were not aristocrats hoarding wealth. They were working people whose deposits funded Cassie's performance. Mrs. Marsh was not a symbol of oppressive class structure, but a grieving widow exploited by someone who weaponized her pain. The truth is probably that these women were multiple things simultaneously. Criminals who stole fortunes, performers who exposed the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies, products of a system that offered women few legitimate routes to power, brilliant strategists who understood human psychology, cautionary tales about the dangers of wanting to believe. What makes their stories enduring is not just the audacity of the cons, but what those cons revealed about desire and belief. The victims were not passive dupes. They were active participants in constructing the illusions that destroyed them. The society matrons wanted a countess to elevate their gatherings, so they ignored inconsistencies in her story. The bankers wanted access to Carnegie's world, so they skipped verification. Mrs. Marsh wanted her husband to still exist somewhere, so she suspended disbelief about obvious fraud. This dynamic has not disappeared. Modern society is still full of people performing identities they have not earned, claiming connections they do not possess, and selling access to worlds that do not exist. The mechanisms have changed. Social media has replaced social clubs. Digital verification has replaced Burke's peerage. But the fundamental con remains the same. Find out what people want desperately to believe, and give them permission to believe it. The con artists of the 1890s succeeded because they understood that human beings are far more invested in maintaining their illusions than in discovering truth. We want to believe in noble bloodlines, secret connections, communication with the dead. We want these things to be true because their truth makes our world more meaningful, more magical, more organized than it actually is, and so we make ourselves vulnerable. We extend trust to people who confirm our worldview. We ignore evidence that contradicts beliefs we find comforting. We participate in our own deception because the alternative is admitting that the world is random, that status is arbitrary, that death is final, and that we are far more ordinary than we want to be. Perhaps the real con was not what these women did. Perhaps the real con was what Gilded Age society had always been. A system where wealth generated in factories and railroads was laundered into respectability through European marriages and charitable foundations. Where new money bought old titles and called it romance. Where human value was determined by ancestry and accent rather than character or achievement. Where grief was commercialized by spiritualists, status was sold by social secretaries, and meaning was purchased at whatever price the market would bear. The con artists simply recognized the fraud at the heart of the system and decided to participate more honestly than those who pretended the hierarchy was natural and earned. They performed status without apology. They claimed power without pretending it was divinely ordained. They stole money while everyone else was stealing dignity. More than a century later, we are still running the same cons, still performing identities on platforms designed for self-creation, still claiming connections to elevate our status, still selling access to exclusive worlds. It's still wanting desperately to believe that someone, somewhere, has the secret knowledge, or the prestigious bloodline, or the spiritual connection that will make our own lives more meaningful. Somewhere right now, someone is inventing a countess. And somewhere right now, someone desperately wants to believe her. The names change, the platforms evolve, but the fundamental transaction remains eternal. We are all performing. We are all pretending. We are all con artists and marks simultaneously, selling and buying the illusions that make existence bearable. The Countess understood this. That is why she escaped. That is why her story endures. Not because she stole diamonds, but because she revealed that everything we think is solid is actually performance. Everything we believe is real is actually faith. And the only difference between a con artist and a socialite is which side of the law legitimizes your particular fraud.